Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a video all about some recent classic DNFs that I've had. I did a version of this video earlier in the year talking about other classics I had DNF'd and it was weirdly popular. So I thought I would update you again since I have decided to DNF quite a few more classics. This is only a handful of the classics that I've actually DNF'd recently, but it is a group that I feel like I have quite a bit to say about why I DNF'd them. So some of these are definitely not permanent DNFs. I am guilty of always saying this, that I'm just not in the mood for a book and that I will definitely return to it. Now, probably about half the time that's true, but about half the time it's not true. Half the time I really do not intend to return to these books and I just need to be honest with myself. Sometimes it is okay to permanently DNF something. So a couple of these are definitely permanent DNFs, and a couple of them I'm really just kind of wrestling with. I really don't want them to be permanent DNFs, but I can see that maybe they might be. So let's just get right into these. I think it is difficult to talk about DNFing classics because for so many of us, we think of classics as like the upper echelon of literature. This is the best that literature has to offer. And so I think you feel guilty when you admit that you didn't really get on with a really popular classic. And I've had to have a long talk with myself and just say, just because something is a classic does not mean that it will work well for me personally, and it certainly doesn't mean that I have to like it. You don't have to read anything, you don't have to like anything either. But I think when dealing with classics, that can be a hard thing to admit to yourself, or to kind of allow yourself to know that it's okay to do. It's okay to DNF classics. So these are just a few of the classics that I have recently DNF'd. Some of them are permanent DNFs, but some of them are not. The first that I want to discuss is the one that I am most ashamed of, and I deeply, deeply want this to just be a temporary DNF. I really want to come back to this and commit to finishing it because this is a giant among classic literature, and it's something that people tend to say they really enjoyed, that once they finished this book, they really enjoyed it, they really enjoyed the long journey that they took with it, and that's War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. You can see where I got. It's not even halfway. I basically got 2 books in. I was annotating it, but you can see that even my annotations fell off because I really just didn't want to read it. I was reading this to read it. I was reading this to say I had read it, and I was deriving absolutely no enjoyment from that process. Now, I was buddy reading War and Peace with Christy Lewis from Dostoevsky in Space and Christina from Knitting Books, etc., and I'll link to their channels down below. And I essentially fell off, and I feel really bad that I abandoned them like that, but I think Christina is the only one of us that actually finished it. And I know that Christy and I struggled with it for very similar reasons. It was a book that we enjoyed when we were reading it, but it was one that we weren't really motivated to pick up again when we set it down. And for me, it did get to the point where I was no longer enjoying it while reading it. Through War and Peace, I've had to come to the conclusion that Tolstoy is just probably not the writer for me. I'm not really sure that I can blame this on translation because I have struggled with a lot of his works, and I have read many different translations of his works. I've read 3 works in full, all in different translations, and there were various aspects of them that I struggled with in each. So I don't think it's something that I can blame on translation. I really have to say that it's probably Tolstoy himself that I just don't really get on with. But I have seen an adaptation of War and Peace, and I really, really enjoyed it. And in fact, years ago, I picked up a copy of War and Peace after watching the BBC miniseries because I just loved the miniseries so much. I was convinced that reading the book would be very easy after having seen it because I knew that I really enjoyed the story. I knew who all of the characters were, and yet that really was not the case for me. I really, really struggled with this. And it got to a point where I just eventually put it down and never picked it back up. And it wasn't even an intentional DNF. I just put it down one day and I have never gone back to it. And I would really like to return to this. This is one that I really deeply want to cross off of my bookish bucket list. And I feel like I should like it. There is a lot about War and Peace that feels like it should work very well for me, but I just could not get on with the characters. I didn't like his writing. I mean, it was just a very strange reading experience where I wondered, was I reading the same book that everyone else has praised ad nauseum for something like 150 years? I really could not believe that I just didn't like this. And maybe it's not so much that I didn't like it, but that I could sense that I was just going to rate this maybe 2 or 3 stars, 2.5 or 3 stars. It was just going to be an okay book. And it's hard to rationalize staying in a book of this length when you know you're only going to give it an average rating, when you know you don't have very many thoughts about it, you don't have much to discuss about it. So this is one that hurts me. I would really like to return to this. I would love to finish it. I've always known that War and Peace is one that I would probably read once just to say I had read it. And I think that's probably true. But as of right now, I have literally zero desire to get back into War and Peace. So maybe that will change one day, and it's probably not going to be anytime soon, but for right now, War and Peace is a DNF. Next up, I have On Painting by Battista Alberti, and this is a classic of the 1400s, and this is basically a classic of the early Italian Renaissance. This was a handbook on essentially how to paint, and it was very, very revolutionary. It was talking about a lot of new techniques in painting, which makes it a classic. It's the reason why it has become a classic, is because it was really informing a lot of the changes that were made during the Italian Renaissance. So this is one that has always been really high on my list for a lot of different reasons. I've always wanted to read it for research purposes, and I cannot believe that I'm going to say it, but I did DNF this. And you see how short it is, but I did DNF it. When I say this is an instruction manual on painting, that's exactly what I mean. It is dry in that way, it is very directional in that way, and I am not really somebody who would ever just sit down and read a manual for fun. And that's what it felt like I was doing every time I thought about picking this up. So I just decided to DNF this, and I feel pretty sure it's probably gonna be a permanent DNF. It's a real shame because Battista Alberti was a very interesting figure in his own right. So I really wanted to give his writing a shot, and I really thought this would be a valuable classic to have under my belt for the Renaissance period. But who knows? It's just one that I really think it's something I would have to take my time with if I came back to it, but I'm trying to be a little bit freer with my permanent DNFs and let myself know that it's okay to put a book down and it's okay to admit that you didn't like it. And so if I'm gonna do that, I have to admit to the fact that I really was not jiving with this, so I don't think that I'm ever gonna return to this one. I unfortunately have 2 Charles Dickenses on this list, and both of them I do fully intend to return to. So let's get the big one out of the way, and that's Bleak House. So a colleague of mine and I started reading Bleak House in October of last year with the intent to read it in its serialized parts. So we were reading a part a month, essentially, which is how Bleak House was originally published. And we really wanted to kind of get into the Victorian mindset. We wanted to read the book as it came out to see if that increased our enjoyment of it, if it tied us to the characters more. We were really kind of going with an experimental approach here, and it absolutely failed us. It was totally the wrong thing to do because we could not remember month to month what happened in the previous section. And then in each individual section, there was very little for us to discuss. Every time we sat down to lunch to talk about our section that we'd read for that month, we both said, what happened in this? What happened in these chapters? And so if we had maybe done it a little bit faster or maybe tried to read 2 sections at a time, I think there would have been more to discuss because frankly, things were happening. But it's just like reading a small segment like that made you feel as though you were treading water. And it also made you feel as though the book was very, very slow, as though nothing was happening. And I've heard since when I've admitted to struggling with this, and my colleague really struggled with it too, so it was something that we both were not really enjoying when we decided to give this up. But I have heard from a lot of people since that the first half of Bleak House is very slow. and that you really need to commit to getting into the second half. And so maybe that's why we didn't have much to discuss, because the first half was very slow. It was setting a lot of things up. But you can see where I got here as well. It also was not halfway, and we both kind of called it quits back in the spring sometime. But the interesting thing is, my colleague has since returned to it, and he read it straight. He read it in one go, and he completely loved it. He really, really enjoyed it, and he said it was very good. And he thought that really the way we were reading it must have been what made the book suffer. That really, even though it was originally published serially, that it probably should just be read as one novel in one go. And definitely that's probably true, because we have so much more nowadays to kind of occupy our attention. So month to month, maybe in the Victorian period, you had a handful of books that you were keeping up with. So it was easy to keep things straight. It was easy to be really engaged and really excited about a particular book, because it was one of a few that you knew about. But now we have so much storytelling occupying our minds. If you listen to audiobooks, if you read other books, if you watch television shows or films, then your brain is occupied with a lot of storytelling. So reading a book month to month in chunks like that doesn't work very well for us in the modern day, is what I believe. So I definitely am encouraged by the fact that he went back to this and that he read it straight through and he really enjoyed it. So hopefully this is one that I can return to and also read straight through, and hopefully I will really enjoy it. I have a very good feeling about Bleak House, and I always have. So it really hurt that I wasn't enjoying it as much. So I think we've made the right call to go on and DNF this and then return to it at another time. So this is definitely not a permanent DNF. I will return to Bleak House. These last two I really want to discuss together, because I think my problem with them is very, very similar. So we have Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, and then we have Treasure Island. And I wanted to discuss these two together because I have very, very similar problems with them. I think for very similar reasons I DNF'd both of these, because Oliver Twist and Treasure Island are both books with characters that have gone on to be incredibly popular in pop culture. They really have characters that have kind of moved past these original stories, and adaptations of these stories are very rarely accurate to what the books actually are. And so Oliver Twist is one that I have been warned about many, many times by even other Dickens fans. I tend to really love Charles Dickens, but a lot of Dickens fans have said Oliver Twist is their least favorite. It is not very well done. And it's very, very true. Oliver Twist is a really interesting one, because in the introduction to this edition, they state that Oliver Twist was not originally intended to be a novel. It was intended to be kind of a social piece. And so that is something that I think comes through in the writing very clearly, is that this was always intended to be a social commentary. And so it tends to be a very overdramatic read where bad things keep happening, essentially to make a point that, hey, life is terrible if you were working in a workhouse. Life is terrible if you were a child that is poor in London. And so it kind of feels as though Oliver really can't catch a break, and that he's never going to catch a break, because that's the entire point of this book, is to kind of lecture people on the things that are going on in the workhouses. So I didn't even really reach probably the most interesting part of the novel that introduced Fagin and the Artful Dodger, because I couldn't get past all of the tragedy in this first section. It was so deeply sad, and I was talking to someone about it, I don't remember who, and I was saying it's just kind of bad. And they said, as in badly written, or that bad things keep happening in the book and it's hard to read. And I said, actually, I'm going to say both. I think it is poorly written for Charles Dickens, and I also think it is a very hard thing to read because it is just deeply upsetting, and that is the entire point of the book. If you read it as a social commentary, that is the entire point of the book. And so I guess it's successful in that, but it's also just a really deeply upsetting thing to read. It's very, very hard to read. This is one that I feel like I probably am just not going to like, but I definitely will return to it because I am a bit of a completionist and I would really like to say that I read all of Charles Dickens one day. So this is one that I kind of have to come back to if I ever want to say that I achieved that. But Oliver Twist is one that I don't really know I will ever really like, and personally, I'm okay with that. But I think you go into Oliver Twist with a certain expectation, and it's very different from what the book actually is. A similar case can be made for Treasure Island because you also go into this book with a certain amount of expectations, and none of them are met, in my opinion. I DNF'd this about halfway through, and I could not believe how bad I thought it was. I think at the end of the day, I just don't like Robert Louis Stevenson because I also did not like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I've tried Kidnapped and I didn't like that. I think at the end of the day, his writing is just not for me. But this is one that I had such high expectations for because Pirates of the Caribbean is one of my favorite films. And so many things that are iconically pirate came about in this book. There's the black spot, when someone has marked you for death. There's all of the great songs, the great sea shanties, treasure being buried somewhere, a map, curses are talked about. I mean, there's so much in it, in the bones of the story, that is really exciting, but the execution of it is terrible in my opinion. I just could not believe that I actually found a book about pirates boring. Now, I do tend to really struggle with books about pirates. I'm always on the lookout for a really great book about pirates, and I have never found one. I truly have never found one that makes me feel the way Pirates of the Caribbean makes me feel. And so this one definitely did not hit that mark, but it's one that I have seen several adaptations of, and I really enjoyed those adaptations. And so I went into this just really expecting to like it, but I have to say, clearly the adaptations make a lot of changes to this source material to make it work, because there was a lot here that I had never seen in an adaptation. And so I think often in these adaptations, they must just take the characters' names and build an entirely more interesting story around them. And I think the same can be said for Oliver Twist. I think you go into Oliver Twist thinking it's going to be like the musical. It absolutely was not, from what I saw. And the similar thing can be said here for Treasure Island. So this is one that I was really disappointed by, and I have absolutely no desire to come back to. So this is one that I'm probably going to unhaul and just let it leave, because I was truly disappointed in this one, and this is definitely a permanent DNF. So those are just a few of the classics that I have recently DNF'd. I would love to know down below if you have read any of these, and if you also struggle with DNFing classics. Do you feel like you should do that or that you shouldn't do that? But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.